special treat. So Dr. Daniel Emina is one of our doctors at Amen Clinics, and I just love working with Dr. Emina. I love that he works for us, and I wanted to share some things on his perspective with our community. So welcome, and thank you so much, Dr. Emina. And I want you to actually describe tell us about your background. Tell me, I want you to tell us your bio. So normally I read the bio, but today I want you to do that.
Excellent. So, Tana, first, thank you so much for having me on. You know how much I appreciate working at Amen Clinics, know how much I appreciate having this platform. I think it's a gift. I thank you guys so much for what you guys are doing. It's having an impact in people's lives. These topics are extremely important to discuss, so I'm glad we're doing this. So briefly about me, for people who, I'm not Tana Amen, so they're not going to know me. So for those who don't know me, who are not my clients, my name is Dr. Daniel Emina. I'm a general psychiatrist and a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I was actually trained over at UCLA, spent a little bit of time in the University of Hawaii Department of Psychiatry. So that's where I got my child and adolescent psychiatric fellowship. To add a little bit of even further backstory for me, I was actually born in Nigeria, Africa. I immigrated here roughly around 8 years old, primarily because if you're an immigrant, you come to the States because it's the land of opportunity. We actually had the statement, the streets are paved with gold, right? So you come here and you recognize the opportunity, you recognize the privilege, and you recognize that it's actually not easy to get here. So I already in many ways felt like I've already won one version of the lotto in life with the opportunity to be here. We lived in Seattle, then Southern California, and then eventually now I'm married, have a beautiful one-year-old, I have a beautiful wife, and I have a beautiful one-year-old daughter. So I'm super, super blessed. As you know, I'm working at the Amen Clinics in the Costa Mesa office. We see mental health as brain health. So we're trying to move that shift over, right? We believe brain health is foundational for all aspects of our function. And I want to take it a step further. I want to say it's fundamental in all movements that aim to better the human experience. And this is the movement we're in right now, a movement to better the human experience.
I love that.
As I answer some of these questions that we're going to be talking about today, I want us to just kind of keep that perspective that I have this immigrant perspective. It's not going to be the exact perspective of the Black American, and please note that I'm not even going to try to speak only from the perspective of the Black American. I'm going to try to represent as many perspectives in the answers that I give. And in many ways, I'm going to be focusing on the science too in our discussion.
Well, I think that's really important. It's one of the things that why I wanted to have you on. So I got criticized early on for not taking a political stand, and that was with intention. We all have our own feelings and beliefs about what's happening. And I think most people are fairly horrified by, what happened to George Floyd. Most rational people don't want social injustice.
Correct.
But we are non-political for a reason. I'm a nurse, my husband's a doctor, and I tell the story about when I was in the hospital one day and a gang member shot a police officer shot the gang member. And so they shot each other. Normally we would not have them on the same unit, but there was no choice. The overflow place, the hospital we would normally send them to had no room. So we had them on the same unit. It was a really interesting day. So
I can imagine.
On one side, gangbangers on the other side, and you don't get to choose.
Yeah.
You don't get to put a value on human life at that point. You are doing your job. You don't allow yourself to go and think that way. Whatever you might think later is set aside, and to say you don't have thoughts about it would be a lie, but that's the reason we don't take a political stand, and we just can't, because we see people from all over the world. And like you said, we're trying to look at it from a scientific standpoint. And that's why I think our discussion today is so critical and so vital to all of this. I love that you're bringing up the perspective of someone who immigrated here versus a Black American. Who maybe has a very different perspective, but they're still both really important. Yeah. And so, I don't know what it was like in your country when you were, how old, you said you were 8 when you came here?
I came first at 5 and then came back again at 8.
Okay. So I don't know what that was like in your country. Did you experience, do they have the same type of, did you feel oppressed the same way? Did you have the same type of experiences? Maybe so, maybe not. I'm not sure. But I think that hatred and prejudice, and those are things that are experienced that they're sort of universal. And I think since the beginning of time, if I understand, because tribes, all like every human tribe, it was a safety thing. It was like my tribe versus your tribe. No matter what tribe you were part of, you were protecting your own tribe. And so I would love to talk to you about the science about that. Like, why do we get into this place of separating, even though now we are supposed to be more evolved?
Yeah. So excellent question. I'm going to kind of relate it all back to even now, right? It does start from this very primitive state or primitive brain state. And I'll actually answer this question by taking us back to what a child brain is trying to accomplish even in the first few months of life. So remember, we're all born helpless, right?
Right.
We can't fend for ourselves. We can't even accurately perceive all elements of our reality. We can't see very well. We're like, where's mom? We don't even know what that is really in the first few stages of life, right? After the first month, we get better at being able to distinguish kind of like our internal world versus the external world. It seems like that would be obvious, right? But no, that's actually not obvious. The ability to kind of tell, oh, I am me and you are mom, is a feat that the brain has to kind of create, how it perceives your reality. But it's an important one, because at that point, when you can start telling self from other objects, other things, you start being able to differentiate these different states. And in these states, you can tell if I'm feeling good versus mom's feeling good versus I'm feeling bad. It doesn't mean mom is feeling bad too. And you eventually get to the state of roughly around month 5, when you can start to separate and individuate from mom. You actually see yourself as separate from mom now. Now, if you can see yourself separate from mom, that means you need to be able to identify mom, right? You need to be able to identify certain sights and sounds that match up with mom, and this is where we start to, babies will even get pretty good at being able to hear their native language a bit better, right? And respond to that. And they'll get better at being able to recognize their caregivers' faces by 5 months. They're already getting pretty good in that. And we've actually seen that you can tell the race. Babies can get pretty good at recognizing race even at a very young age, like 5 months. They get even better by, a year. They react more swiftly. They can really tell the difference between a face that matches maybe their mom's or what they believe their own face may be. It's usually related to mom. And they get quicker and they're better at these expressions much quicker. Now, basically, this is the foundation for bias. As weird as that may sound, or as simple as that may sound, it's needed to establish safety. It's needed to establish trust and survival. That capacity to discern us from them is literally fundamental in the human brain. And it's also the foundation for this term called unconscious or implicit bias, right? It's this, and think of this, it's an immediate, it's reflexive, it's defensive reaction to the other. Like, it happens, your brain turns it on. And I'm actually going to talk about this a little bit later, and it overlaps with some aspects of trauma, why trauma responses can be so quick, right? So it ends up being this scaffolding that unfortunately we start to build our social categorization. You're other, so let me add a little bit more data to other. My stereotypes, the prejudices, the intergroup conflict, the inequality, the war, the genocide, starts in a very primitive sense to protect self, but unfortunately it builds and we add more to it, and it's unfortunately what leads to some of the challenges we're facing these days.
So interesting. You mentioned something about trauma. So I feel like it's insensitive to ever try to say you understand what another person is going through, especially someone from another race or someone from another. We can't know what someone else is going through, right? You just can't. I will never understand what a black man goes through. Never going to happen. But at the same time, the closest I think I can ever come to that, and this is what I've tried to use, even to explain it to my daughter and our nieces that live with us. And my daughters are Hispanic, so they have a different perspective on life, and they came into our home with trauma and a different set of fear-based value system, I guess, based on their experience, right? Because they had a lot of trauma and things that happened because of that. So it was really interesting. But I was attacked at 15 when I was walking to high school, not to mention I also experienced significant childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And after being attacked by a very large white man in a suit, by the way, it was just
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't see it coming, I guess, because, we all have this idea of what someone who would attack you would look like. And I was wrong. It was a white guy in a suit, attacked me from behind and tried to drag me down an alley.
Yeah.
And ever since then, I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. I will never forget the feeling of power over. You will never forget the feeling of someone overpowering you and traumatizing you.
Yeah.
And because of that, like I will often say a 6'2" man walking down the street will never be able to identify with a 120-pound female or 110-pound female. They can't identify with that. Just like I can't identify with someone who's grown up with extreme prejudice,
Right.
against them, culturally.
Yeah.
So I try to use that fear.
Well, and our goal and the part of even having this conversation, which we'll get into more a little bit, is we still try to understand as
Right.
best as you can. You can't fully get there. You're never going to fully get there, right? Unless you literally went and experienced that exact same thing. But part of being relational beings is that we do our best to walk this journey together. We do our best to understand each other in the context of our journey. So being able to share in it, you telling your story impacts someone who has a similar story, or impacts someone who doesn't have a similar story at all, but they dealt with their own trauma. There's an element there where it just connects to the deepest core part of us, which is we want to be safe. We want to feel safe, right? And I think if we can all identify that with that feeling, I want to be safe. I want to know that people around me are going to treat me well. Right?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love that. So how is this current climate affecting the patients that you're seeing? And it's interesting because you're a child psychiatrist. And so when quarantine hit, I'm a nurse, and I'm like, oh, I've got this. I get germs. I can do this. Like I can get my family safe. I can do all this. Like let's kick it into gear. When the social unrest kicked in, it triggered me from my own childhood. I got triggered big time because my home environment didn't feel safe to me. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, my home environment didn't feel safe to me. Whether that was true or not, that's what it triggered in me. And so I noticed that a lot of people started to feel unsafe. And we're noticing a lot of, like at the clinics, anxiety, panic disorders, depression, all these things. And I'm hearing that even kids are experiencing weird things. What are you seeing with the social climate, or with the climate at the clinics, based on what's happening socially?
So excellent question. And it's tough, right? Because there's this overlap with COVID-19, right? Once in like a multi-generation type event, right? That has impacted all aspects of our function, all aspects of things that we know and predict and say, this is what my life is like, is not the same anymore. And especially for kids. Kids like predictability. I mean, that's actually one of the tools we work on first to help manage behavior, create predictability, right? It's a great way to manage anxiety in the first place. All of a sudden, we're living in a world that is unpredictable, all aspects of it. You don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know what the new mandate is going to be from government as to how you can interact with your friends and your peers. You're telling your kids, hey, you can't run out around and go play with those other kids there because you might get something. And if you get something, you might kill grandma. What? That's very scary. So interestingly, I've had a gamut of reactions. I have some clients who it's not as big of a contributor to their current set of symptoms or their concerns. And then I've definitely had the clients where it is a significant contributor. Some people, they're more impacted by COVID. Some people, they're more impacted by the concerns related to social justice. And passionately so. So much so that it is triggering for them. Right. And for two aspects. One, initially, some people actually got exposed, even young clients got exposed to the video, unfortunately, of the murder. And unfortunately, others, they did get exposed, but they may have saw it a little differently. Right. So it changes your perception of it, your perspective of it. I think no one liked what they saw. And luckily, a lot of parents actually hopefully prevented their kids from seeing that. But for some kids, they did see that, and they not only saw that, they saw the following riots and everything. And depending on what news channel you're watching, you're worried that it's going to come right down your street.
Exactly.
And you're worried that they're going to come and get you.
Right.
And that's frightening. Both sides. I've seen this with African American clients. I've seen it with my Caucasian clients. I've seen it both ways. Some people pretend it's not happening.
Yep.
That's another way to manage it. So there is a gamut of reactions to it.
It's really interesting. Yeah, no, I like what you're saying about that. One thing that, so within my own family, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that a lot of people are experiencing this, people are within my own family have a vastly different opinion on how
Yeah.
this whole thing should be handled. I'm talking about the social, well, even COVID also, but the social aspect of what's happening. I mean, we've got, all the way from the extreme right fundamental to the extreme left socialist perspective. And I'm listening to this within my own family, like the fighting within my own family. Forget the news. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So it's really interesting when you're listening to this within your own family and you're trying to navigate it and you're trying to help your kids make sense of it, but your own family's fighting about it. How do you suggest, I mean, our kids are going to go back to school at some point and they're going to have to deal with all of this. How do we come together? How do we learn how to respect each other? One thing I noticed, I'm going to let you answer this, but one thing I noticed within our own family, even because we believe in opening conversations. We don't want to squash that, especially with teenagers.
Yeah.
So I've noticed that even on the opposite ends, they're on the opposite ends of their how they think we should get to a certain place, but what they really want underneath it all is the same.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've noticed that. It's like we want social justice, we want safety, we want our kids to be safe, we want certain things. It's just how we think we're going to get there is different.
Yeah. So spectacular question, and I've been really thinking about this a lot. I mean, I've been reading both sides, both perspectives. I watch both news channels, like all the ends of the perspective there, because it's helpful just to get a sense of how people are viewing this. It's also in some ways very anxiety provoking and stressful. I actually started to tell my clients, don't watch too much of this stuff because it's going to stress you out. If you're just too deep into it, it's just going to stress you out because whether it's social media, however, they're built to stress you out, unfortunately.
Yep.
So you got to, on that first front, not too much of it. But one of the things I've realized in just working through this is that if you think back, before the social justice movement, there were protests already.
Yeah.
Right? There were already people who were frustrated to abuses of power. In the context of the lockdowns, there were people that were armed.
Yeah.
Our government buildings already frustrated in the context of what had been going on. Here's what's all shared in this 7 months of this year so far. We're all scared a bit. We don't know what's going on. People are telling us all different stories. Frankly, it's easier to almost believe the conspiracy theories because at least there's an explanation for all of this, and at least it puts maybe an end to it, or at least it gives you a way to feel power over it, right? Versus what this reality of, do we have a good enough plan? Are we going to manage this? Is it really coming back? What are they telling me it's coming back? Can I get my kids to school, for goodness sake? It's tough raising these kids in the house all the time. There was a lot of anxiety, a lot of pent up anger, frustration in the first place. And that same emotional energy fed into this social justice movement. Now, the social justice movement was already going on. So it just fed into it, and it created this intensity, this burst that made George Floyd's killing be this kind of spark for this, right?
And I was actually going to ask you sort of just answered, because I was going to say we've had many other situations that were similar, actually. Yeah. And why the tipping point all of a sudden? But I think you answered it by saying we've had all this pent up frustration. We're not working. We're suffering financially for a lot of, some people are suffering financially, but there's just a lot going on. And it seems like that really did feed into it.
The pent up fear of it all, right? We're bored. We're sitting at home. We're not doing as much. We're frustrated. We're angry, right? All of a sudden, boom. We were just looking for our own particular spark, right? Each group was looking for their own particular spark. The prior groups who were looking for the spark for the lockdowns, government control, government overreaching their bounds. Really, it's actually the same arguments, right? That's what people who are asking for social justice in many ways are saying, hey, government, there's aspects of government that overreach at times.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They were having the same argument. It's just, how does it impact you in particular?
Right.
So if it impacted you by limiting your freedoms in this particular way, then you were frustrated. If it impacted you because of the color of your skin, then you were frustrated.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily invalidate either person's argument just because you don't see it their particular way, right? But it still stems from the same concern. We were fearful. We felt that at times government overreached their bounds, their levels of control, and we felt that we needed to stand up in some ways. And I think that's what overall society is doing, depending on, irrespective of which side of the spectrum you're on.
Do you have a tip for people who, like, even if they're in the same house or they work together, who have just wildly different viewpoints? How do you find peace to work together or to be in the same house together?
So this is this is one where we're all learning and working on in the moment. I always say it starts with your own individual self-care. So if I'm doing couples counseling or whatever with a couple, how are you taking care of yourself first before we start working on the unit, right? Individual self-care. Watch some of the other videos that are, sleep, do these other things, exercise, eat right. Do your individual self-care because you can modulate your own behavior, your mood, and etc. Right? Different viewpoints are welcome. I think that's really what the fix of this all is, and I'm just hinting at it, but the fix of this all is, can we get to a space where we can understand that someone else has walked a different journey than we have, and recognize that and even respect them for that, right? That's tough, and I'm not saying everybody's going to get there. That's like climbing a mountain in some ways. But can you get to a space where you have your viewpoints, someone else has their viewpoints, you recognize that you may never exactly reach the same level of compromise, but can you have peace? Can you have a point where you're like, okay, I see you see it this particular way, and I'm going to still show some respect and care for you. Now, it's a whole different conversation if someone really is bigoted or racist or whatever. You're not going to convince them. So don't worry about that. But focus more on the areas that there are overlap. Focus more on the areas where there's understanding, appreciation, and just leave it be. I think there's so much we can do on this particular topic because it's going to be a long one to have. Having these conversations like this is part of the fix.
I love that. And if someone's commenting on my cat who decided to intrude, so I apologize.
No problem.
Not have any manners, but I grew up with my stepdad who was an extreme bigot. Okay. And what's interesting is I have a new book coming out. It's called The Relentless Courage of a Scared Child. And my stepdad is one of the main characters in the book because a big part of it was how he spoke to me as a kid. Yeah. So what's interesting is this guy was career military, sort of a redneck. He was definitely a bigot. But I was so, as a kid, I think we innately sort of know right from wrong. I knew it wasn't right. At the same time, I didn't have a lot of experience in life yet, but I was so busy being angry and worried about how he spoke to me, how he treated me. I wasn't really that worried about how he was talking about other people at the time. Yeah. Because I was defending myself. Correct. And so it took me growing up and going away and having an adult experience, going to college, opening my mind, having friends of all different cultures, and coming home and realizing, wow, this is so toxic. I can't believe I grew up with this. Yeah. It was stunning to me how toxic it was. And then I remembered, wow, I grew up with this. Yeah. And so many of us grow up in that, and we don't really have a choice as kids. Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, all forms of bias in many ways, as I said, start with, irrespective of what kind of bias is presenting it, whether it's racial or gender-based or it's socioeconomic based, all forms of bias in many ways start the same way. And we build on top of that, right? We build the stereotypes, the prejudices and such on top of that. And we train our brain to become even more biased. We train those particular neurons to look out for those differences and then find ways to exploit those differences. That manifests in the way we can harm each other at times. It doesn't always have to be in the context of race. It can just be in the context of repeated familial trauma, right? We've trained, our brains have been trained into a particular way that unfortunately leads us to harm each other.
Right.
The modifier for this, really, it comes down to the brain again, prefrontal cortex. It's your frontal lobes. Whatever you're doing to strengthen and increase the knowledge of your prefrontal cortex helps you regulate your limbic or your emotional brain. That amygdala, the amygdala that is related to trauma, the amygdala that is actually, interestingly enough, related to bias because it's our alarm system. The part of you that regulates that amygdala that says there's a different way to do this is your prefrontal cortex. How do you take care of that? Many of the other videos and talks that you've done relate to that, taking care of your health. That's why I always start there. But then the secondary piece there is then feeding that prefrontal cortex with knowledge of the experience of others, knowledge of ways to better communicate, right? I mean, that's a skill set. That's why people go to therapy. That's why, again, we need to have these conversations.
Right.
Not just us, but hundreds and thousands of these same conversations need to be happening. Millions of these same conversations need to be happening, because when we force ourselves to do so, it brings up this implicit biases. It brings it up to the surface. We have a greater level of awareness, and then now we can intentionally, with our prefrontal cortex, act to regulate our fear.
Yeah, no, I like that. You're just so helpful with all of this. I know there's one conversation that I had in my book that happened with my stepdad, and it was a very toxic one, and you can imagine the language he was using.
Yeah.
He's a bigot, right? And so I put it in there intentionally. They wanted me to take it out based on what's happening in the world right now. And I said, why would I do that? Based on what's happening in the world right now, why would I insult people and pretend like it's not happening or it didn't happen? To me, that feels insulting. So they're like, well, then you at least have to take out like the N word. I'm like, but it's real. People do that. They hurt people with this. The point I'm making is that we need to not do this.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's insulting to people to pretend like it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just my own viewpoint on it. So I had to like sort of fight with my publisher. But I feel like it's a necessary conversation to have. And I have it with my kids, our kids in the house a lot, but teaching them empathy and teaching them how to talk to people by showing them what not to do based on the pain that we've experienced in the past. Yeah. And so at least in our house.
And that's where it starts, right? Exactly what you just stated there. I actually think a lot of this change that we're looking for is not necessarily going to start purely from legislation. I think it's going to start in the home, around the dinner table. Yeah. The fact that we're all sitting at home now, forced to face this stuff. I personally believe things happen for a reason. We're all forced to face this. We're all forced to face this aspect of our shared history. And what are we going to do with it? Are we going to double down? Or are we going to say, well, maybe I can look at this a little bit differently? I mean, children by 4 to 5 years old, there was a study out of Northwestern on this. Children by 4 to 5 years old already had a strong and consistent pro-white bias.
Oh, wow.
And partially the reason for that is just what you're shown, what you're seeing, right? What you see all the time, how people
the language, all of
the language. So they're picking it up very early on like that.
Right.
And this is why it becomes important to be able to directly speak on it and not feel like you can't speak on it. When the kids ask the question and you feel, oh, no, why'd you ask that? I don't want to talk about this. Talk about it. Have those uncomfortable conversations, because that's necessary for the change that we're looking for.
No, I love that. I think we are almost out of time. I want people to actually be able to reach out to you if they need to, because you are fabulous. You have a bunch of people on here that are your patients who just love you. You can call this number, 844-818-0616. And that's if you know someone struggling. We know a lot of people struggling right now. You can reach out and talk to Dr. Emina. He's seeing people by telemedicine. And I know we didn't even get to supplements. I feel like I need to have you back on to talk about alternate, ways that people can help to manage their anxiety, whether it's GABA, 5-HTP, whatever, how they can sleep. So I don't know if you'd be willing to come back on, but I feel like we just scratched the surface.
Most definitely. You're absolutely right. It is just scratching the surface. There's so many elements of this that are important. And as I said earlier, brain health impacts all level of our function, right? And I believe it's fundamental to improving the human experience. And part of our discussion here is to democratize that, right? Mm-hmm. Make it easy for people to access improved brain health.
I love that. Thank you so much, Dr. Emina.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You're just awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
All right, thanks.